So in the previous video, we spent some time talking about the Brussels Conference, one of the most important periods in European imperial history, specifically and ultimately resulting in the scramble for Africa, the claims of Leopold II over the Congo Basin and all of these different areas. This lesson is going to focus on the Berlin Conference, which takes place a little bit after that of the Brussels Conference. It takes place between 1884 and 1885. And we'll explain what its background and motivations were, some of the other key areas of sort of international relations associated with this period, some of the general provisions and agreements that were established by the Berlin Conference, and its ultimate conclusion and its impact and its legacy. So we are talking about a period of quite extensive imperial expansion into the African continent. Fundamentally, the Berlin Conference, which was convened between 1884 and 1885 and was convened by German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, was a part of the very important period of the so-called scramble for Africa. So specifically, if you want some more specific details, it was held between the 15th of November 1884 and the 26th of February 1885 in Berlin, hence the name, and it aimed to essentially regulate. European colonization and trade in Africa, leading to the partitioning of the continent among the major European powers. Now, in terms of the major European powers, it was attended by the representatives of 14 different nations. There was, of course, Germany, who was hosting the conference, as well as France, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Belgium, and the United States, among some of the other smaller nations as well. In terms of its background and motivations, the conference was prompted almost exclusively by the scramble for Africa, this sort of period of intense European competition and European competition specifically for territorial acquisition in Africa. Prior to the conference, European powers had sought to establish coastal trading posts and colonies, but the interior of Africa remained largely under indigenous control. Even the Brussels Conference, which was established in 1876, by King Leopold, sought to establish a greater foothold of European imperialism in the central part of Africa a few years prior. But this had still been relatively uncharted territory. There's still quite a lot of the central parts of Africa that had still yet to be explored and to be colonized. The conference then sought to formalize and to regulate the acquisition of African territories and to prevent conflict among European nations. So this was a conference that essentially didn't care one iota about the native population living in Africa. They were more concerned with making sure that there would not be any kind of European conflict between European powers in acquiring African territory. So that was essentially the motivation, the pretext for this conference. Now, the General Act was the concluding agreement that was associated with the Berlin Conference, and it had a number of very key provisions, the first of which was this idea of free trade and navigation. The Act declared essentially that the Congo Basin and the Niger River would be free for trade and navigation for all nations. So neither the Congo Basin nor the Niger River would be allowed, let's say, to be colonized and created and fall under, let's say, the exclusive competence of any single nation or state or imperial empire. This was, of course, intended to ensure that there would be equal access to these vital waterways and to promote commerce and prevent any kind of monopolizing of these areas. Specifically in terms of the provisions of the General Act, Article 2 of the General Act stipulated that all flags without distinction of nationality should have free access to the coastline, the rivers, and the lakes of the Congo Basin. Article 3 of the General Act emphasized that goods imported into these regions should be subject to no other taxes than those that are levied as the fair compensation and expenditure in the interests of trade. So there should be no additional taxes that would disincentivize people from essentially going and importing goods into this part of Africa. Article 9 of the General Act, so we're jumping ahead a little bit here. Article 9 was the article which essentially declared that the slave trade be, quote, absolutely and entirely suppressed. That's the quote from the General Act itself. All the signatory powers committing to take measures to prevent the slave trade, the perpetuation of the slave trade within their respective spheres of influence. Now, while this was seen on paper and sort of seen through rose-tinted glasses as a significant humanitarian gesture, its enforcement was very inconsistent, and the legacy of the slave trade continued to affect African societies, as you can probably imagine. A lot of the sort of positive humanitarianism associated with imperialism during this period, it should be viewed with a little bit of a pinch of salt. Of course, declaring to absolutely and entirely suppress the slave trade is objectively a good thing, but there's still some caveats associated with this. The inconsistent enforcement of this and the legacy of the slave trade still being very much in the minds of many who were victims of the slave trade. The Act also stipulated that the Congo Basin would be neutral. The Act declared that the territories within the Congo Basin would be neutral, and this meant that there would be a prohibition on any kind of military occupation or the building of any kind of fortifications as well. Again, the aim is to maintain peace among European powers, not to try and present some kind of rational justification for supporting indigenous populations, for example. One of the most important principles that we start to see coming out of the Berlin Conference and the General Act is this idea known as effective occupation. Now, effective occupation was justified as a way to try and prevent European powers from claiming territories without actually being able to control those territories. Just basically pointing to a map, pointing to some uncharted territory, and despite the fact that you have no presence in that territory, you just point to that map and say, that's mine. As empires could have theoretically done. And so the principle of effective occupation was introduced in this act. I believe Article 35. I'm trying to read the. It's Roman numerals XXXV. Article 35, I believe that is, stated that any power taking possession of a tract of land on the coasts of Africa must establish authority that is sufficient to protect any kind of existing rights and to ensure that there is freedom of trade and transit. And so this essentially meant that we can ensure that colonial claims were actually backed by some kind of actual physical, tangible presence and governance, that you can't just say that you own a place without having any kind of connection to it. This introduces this idea of effective occupation. Continuing further, then, the notification of territorial claims would be required under the General Act as well. Any new territorial claims or protectorates on the African coast would have to be notified to the other signatory powers, again to try and prevent conflicts and to ensure there is transparency between the various different European powers. Article 34 of the General Act mandated that this be the case, that essentially the powers taking possession of land must inform other signatories to allow for protests if there were any grounds for objecting to taking that territory. And then the last two, we have spheres of influence being developed during this period. The Act emphasised the concept of spheres of influence, the idea that European powers could have certain exclusive rights to certain parts of Africa, whereas other European powers can have access to other parts of Africa, specifically Central Africa, to try and lay the groundwork for a colonial mapping of Africa where all the European powers aren't stepping on each other's toes. And then finally, the preamble of the Act, which is quite interesting. Within a treaty, within an international treaty, you have something known as a preamble. A preamble is essentially just a number of quite flowery and positive language that essentially gives you an indication of what that treaty is intending to do, ensuring that this happens or that happens, and undertaking to do X, Y, and Z. Now, Interestingly, in international law, preambular language is not legally binding. The preamble to a treaty is not legally binding in a strict sense. So the preamble of the Act, of the General Act for the Berlin Conference, emphasizes the development of commerce and the development of civilization in Africa, aiming to improve the moral and material well-being of the indigenous populations, which of course is, as critics would argue, used as a facade to justify imperial ambitions. It's very nice and well that you are putting into the preamble of your General Act all of these humanitarian concerns when the vast majority of the content of the General Act contains stuff concerning the taking of indigenous lands, fundamentally. The result is that this had a quite disparate impact on African territories. Firstly, it led to ethnic displacement. The conference division of Africa into approximately 50 colonies ignored completely any ethnic, linguistic, or cultural boundaries that may or may not have already existed on the African continent at the time. This led to the forced amalgamation of distinct groups within single colonial territories, as well as the splitting of other groups across multiple borders. This arbitrary collection of borders is a source of persistent conflict, even to this day, in not just Africa, but also in the Middle East and also in other parts of Asia. The sort of arbitrary dividing of borders is probably one of the most impactful legacies of colonialism that we still feel to this day, where borders are arbitrarily drawn, and this causes ethnic conflicts, and it also causes conflicts about on the basis of geography. We also see that, of course, this is a colonial and imperialistic ambition. European powers exploited Africa's natural resources for economic gain, things like the extraction of valuable commodities such as rubber and diamonds and gold and ivory, with little regard for the well-being of the local population. This would also lead to the disruption of indigenous political structures, disrupting existing social structures across Africa, as well as disrupting social and cultural existing cultures and societies. Colonial policies promoting racial segregation, for example, and discrimination, treating Africans as second-class citizens. And then this idea of arbitrary borders and effective occupation, of course, established that there would be continuing ethnic and political conflicts in Africa, which of course still exist to this very day. And at least nominally, the Berlin Conference aimed to address humanitarian concerns, but in reality, this was just a facade for the continued occupation and continued colonizing, should I say, and imperialism that takes place within the African continent.